Hi, everybody. It's Professor Spears with the next episode of Human Services in Northwest Indiana, and we're continuing the conversation that we started in our last episode about post traumatic stress disorder and different treatments that are available for that, and some of the symptoms that people experience. And when we left off, we were talking about this new type of uh, mind mapping technique. And Robin was discussing that, and she said that I'll let her pick up. If you could tell us a little bit about the way that mind mapping works, and then I've got a question that I'd like to ask you about that.
Okay. Yeah. So the way, and we call it, we build a metric, which is the equivalent of a map. And it's like the brain is in an upside down triangle with the brainstem at the bottom, with the frontal cortex at the top. And I think one thing that's important to understand that was really critical in my learning was that, the brain develops from the bottom up and the inside out. And whatever input comes into our brain filters in the same way. So it filters through the brainstem. So it has to go through those more primitive parts of our brain before it gets to the smarter or more highly developed parts of our brain. So, so when we do a metric and we map someone's brain and identify areas of maybe diminished development, we can generate recommendations that are not necessarily therapeutic, but will help further develop those areas that are underdeveloped. So one of the kinds of recommendations that we might make are repetitive and rhythmic activities. So we know that the brain responds to dosing and spacing. So you dose with an activity, maybe 7 minutes in duration, and you take a break and you do that's the spacing, and then another dose. So maybe you do these activities 3 times a day. So if we're thinking about repetitive rhythmic activities, they could be things like drumming. They could be rocking or swinging. They could be listening to music while cooking. Cooking, if you think about chopping, is repetitive and rhythmic, so is stirring. Listening to music while raking or shoveling. Also, other sensory things like relaxing under a weighted blanket or wearing ankle weights and wrist weights.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see, they could be things like using those elastic stretch bands to pull and release. So that dosing and spacing of those kinds of repetitive rhythmic activities actually will fuel our brains because that's what our brains are craving. And so oftentimes the kinds of recommendations we make are things that people already like and enjoy. And that is most likely because your brain is already craving those things. So in many ways, it can give you permission to engage in some of those activities throughout the day. So, some of the recommendations can be therapeutic in nature, but some of them can be just regular everyday activities that you're doing with intention.
So, is it well developed enough so that you can tailor your recommendations to target that specific portion of the brain that needs a little more development?
So it's, excuse me, we take the metric, and that is filtered into 4 different areas of functioning. So we're looking at sensory integration, self-regulation, relational, and cognitive. And so we then take the metric and filter the need for intervention in each one of those 4 areas. So let's say it's like you really have an essential need for relational um, intervention. So that might be sitting with your partner or your parent or a loved one and doing back-to-back breathing, or doing healing touch or massage. In terms of cognitive, we might look at pursuing a new hobby or developing a new skill, learning something new. For sensory integration, we might do some of those things like the listening to music and doing something rhythmic and repetitive. And so it won't necessarily, the interventions don't necessarily target each one of those 32 areas of our central nervous system functioning, but when we maybe give recommendations and we can map someone's brain in 6 months and see that the exercises that they're doing are making an impact in those different areas of functioning.
And how has, because things always come back to being able to be financed, how does third-party payment, how have they responded to this? Are they recognizing it?
They are recognizing it. So you can,
Wonderful.
like as a provider, you can bill it as an individual session to do that assessment. And to review then recommendations with a client. I'm working on a project with the LaPorte Police Department where their social worker wrote a grant and got funding specifically for their police officers and firefighters to have their brains mapped. So we don't even have to go through their insurance. We can just do that for officers or firefighters that are interested in having that. So yeah, many different ways to go about that.
So this is something that you could see as reasonably being rolled out to where we started our conversation with the first responders. Wonderful.
Yes.
Wonderful. And one thing that, as we're starting to wind down, one thing that I wanted to ask about, just generally about post-traumatic stress disorder, people throw PTSD around a lot.
Right.
Do you find that it is frequently inaccurately used? And if so, what can we do? And do you think that that minimizes true cases of post-traumatic disorder? And I'd like to hear your thoughts about that too.
You want to go first?
Let's see where to start on this one. How about we pass it on to you and let you roll with it and I'll bounce off you?
Yeah, sure.
That sounds good.
Yeah. I do think that people use PTSD in a way that's kind of flippant and diminishes the real struggle that people have. And I find that the use of the word trauma in and of itself is overused and misused. So people will maybe think that they're experiencing trauma because they've had a bad hair day. Well, that's not trauma. And I think that we really need to be careful about the use of that word so we don't diminish the reality of people who are struggling with traumatic, capital T, traumatic experiences, so we don't diminish the impact that makes on people's lives. So I know in our classrooms at Purdue Northwest, we really do convey that to our students, that we discourage the misuse of that language, whether it's the word trauma applied inappropriately, or the title PTSD used inappropriately, because we want to really value the experiences of people like Keith who've experienced life-threatening or life-altering experiences, and honor those kinds of experiences for the powerful ones that they are.
Would you say that the same thing is true for the word triggering?
Yes, I think that's a good point, Professor Spears. I think it is.
Yeah, that gets thrown around far too flippantly, and it does minimize those who have truly gone through something. And did you want to piggyback?
So when we talk about triggers, and that's a thing too, is that when you go through the process and you're starting to find things out and you're getting the information and starting your treatment journey, that once with PTSD, when triggers, I'm still having them. And a lot of times I don't even know what they are till it happens. Now, of course, there are some that when they do start, it gives some kind of an inkling that, hey, I know, okay, something's coming. But then there's other times where it happens out of the blue. And then, of course, it's the aftermath that now, depending, hopefully it's not too bad, that we're now sitting there and processing and talking on, okay, well, this is what happened because of this. Now we got to keep that in the back of the brain. So hopefully the next time it happens, it doesn't escalate quickly.
Mhm.
You can minimize that trigger and move it off to the side and be ready for the next one if one should come.
And that takes a lot of insight.
It does.
And it takes a lot of personal motivation to rewind the tape and what was going on, what happened,
Mm-hmm.
that was the incident, the set of circumstances that led me to have that kind of a reaction.
Mm-hmm. And a lot of it's learning about yourself.
Right.
Knowing that, okay, when this happens, this is what's going to happen.
Mhm.
And as you go through the process, and as I have and many others have, you start to learn more about yourself that you didn't know before.
Mhm.
But then what helps too is getting that information that's available to you by the research, the stats, everything that's out there, and putting all those puzzle pieces together. And once it comes together and it makes sense, it just makes the journey so much easier.
And that makes me think about the spouses and partners of
Mhm.
people who are going through this, and how probably incorporating into working with the person who has experienced the trauma, but the family system itself. So that if he's discovering things about himself, I would imagine the people, his intimate circle of people, that they likewise would be learning the same way. And then, as we talked about in the first portion of our episode, the good communication skills that you would develop so that you can clue them in. Because I would guess that sometimes reactions, they're wondering where that came from. What did I do to get this kind of response?
Right. And back at the very beginning, uh, there was times that my wife would be, both of the stepdaughter and wife would be walking on eggshells, because as soon as I came home, okay, what's going to be his mood? Is there going to be that switch where everything's cool, or is it going to be completely the other way? And it was, she told me at one point that she really thought about divorcing me because she didn't know how much more she could take. But something told her to stick with me and ride the journey out. And here we are still. We'll be coming up on 15 years next month. Sorry, I take that back. 18 years total. 18 years total next month.
Well, when she watches this, you're going to be in big trouble for getting the number of years wrong.
Right.
Well, that's okay. I've had mental I have a mental therapy problem, and it affects my memory. So sometimes my numbers are not 100% correct, sir.
So she just might let you off.
Correct. I have enough brownie points stashed away. Yes. Utilize those brownie points.
So, any parting thoughts as we're winding down, as a person who lives with PTSD? Is there anything that you would like to leave our audience knowing that maybe they did not know before?
When in doubt, if you think that you're falling underneath that recipe that comes together to formulate PTSD, it's time to talk to somebody. If you're having thoughts and wondering if you do, you probably do. And as soon as the quicker you can get through the process to start that journey to get yourself better, the better off you will be, and the better off the people around you will be.
Great.
But definitely communication is key, and a solid support system. You have to have that. And it doesn't, the support system, if it's not family, it doesn't have to be family. It can be your secondary family, whatever the case may be, just have that positive support system.
Okay, great advice.
Yes.
And Robin, what would you leave us with?
Well, I think that sometimes when we think about trying to connect with or help someone who's struggling with traumatic experiences, we think about trying to like talk them out of it or reason with them in a way that's like if somebody's legitimately been triggered, we want to talk them out of it. When and this goes back to what we talked about in the first episode about DBT, this idea of helping somebody to get regulated first, to relate with them so they feel connected and safe and cared for before we reason with them is really the right recipe for intervention.
Because they're not going to be responsive.
They're not
when
going to be
their
able to.
emotions
Right.
are completely out of control.
Right.
Very good. Well, thank you both so much for being guests. It's been a pleasure to speak with you both. I've learned a lot, and I hope that our audience has as well. And I thank you all for tuning in and watching another episode. And if you found this helpful, please spread the word. Make sure that you tell your family and friends. And if you can like us and subscribe, that always helps. So until next time, I'm Professor Spears, and I wish you good mental health. Thank you.